this will be available to the group after the workshop. I'll send out a link to everybody that was registered. There are a lot of people that did register that aren't able to make it live, so we'll make it available to them. So welcome. This is our third workshop in our ethnographic workshop series for Fulbrighters. I've been working closely with Zoe, who's the founder of Fulbridge, who's been organizing this in partnership with Fulbrighter Network and also EducArte, which is a nonprofit organization that I am a co-founder and president of. So we're really excited to bring this third workshop to you. The first one that we did was back in March, back when we were all just learning what Zoom was. And it was about cultural encounters during Fulbright workshop, or Fulbright research. And, you know, kind of the initial idea for this workshop came from the idea that all of us who are doing Fulbright research are coming from very different disciplines. We're all over the world. We have very different methodologies, but what we all have in common is this kind of cultural encounter that we all have to navigate when we are traveling to a new country. So that first workshop was a panel discussion that was led by a group of people from various disciplines, but we got together just to kind of get some ideas out in the open and see what we were all thinking about. The second workshop was in May. We talked about participant observation, specifically in terms of ethnographic research. And now here we are to talk specifically about interviewing. So we've been kind of building this up. And the next workshop will be in 2 months at the end of September to talk about publication, communication, any kind of application that you apply your Fulbright research or Fulbright findings to. So I'll give a moment for Zoe to talk a little bit about Fulbridge and the workshops that she's been organizing and the work that they do. And you're muted, Zoe.
And I'm muted, okay. Great, yes, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, let me make sure that the share worked real quick. All right, did that work out? Is the sharing good to go? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, yes, hello there, and thank you all for being here. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what Fulbridge is, just because I know some of you may have heard of it and some of you may not have. So kind of broadly speaking, Fulbridge aims to continue the learning that we all kind of start on our grants with one another by actively continuing to build bridges between Fulbrighters, whether that's during Fulbrighter's grant or whether that's as our experiences as alumni through kind of education and continued cultural exchange. And so this workshop is a kind of perfect expression of that mission. And so just to give some brief background on Fulbridge as well as the Fulbrighter Network, because both of those, you may be familiar with both of them or one of them, and it can be a bit confusing, I think, that they're both in the space. But Fulbridge was founded in 2015 by myself and a group of other grantees. So it's very much a for grantees, by grantees, or kind of for alumni, by alumni, grassroots effort coming from kind of that side of things. And we have a group of team members who are all current grantees or alumni who really work on active engagement and community building within the kind of online space that is like the group of Fulbrighters that we are. And so they organize, you know, workshops like this one, and career chats will be launching, as well as, you know, stories on our blog that really showcase the diversity of Fulbright experiences. Fulbrighter Network was launched in August of 2019, so almost a year ago, and it's institutionally supported by the Fulbright organization. And I think a good way to think about kind of the relationship between Fulbridge and Fulbrighter that we've struck now is that the Fulbrighter Network is very much kind of like a gathering place. It's like they've built the community center building. And I think Fulbridge in a way are the people who are kind of organizing events in the community center and making sure that there are exciting things and reasons to go to the community center because, you know, if there's nothing happening in the community center, people might not ever go to that building. And so I think that's kind of our role, is to make sure that there are really exciting opportunities for Fulbrighters to participate in and connect through, just like this one. So I'll hand it back over to our panelists.
Thanks, Zoe. That's great. Um, yeah, I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat right now, just so that you all have them. The first one I'm going to share is our agenda for today, in case you don't have the email that I sent out yesterday, or you need to pull it up again. The second one that I'm putting in here is a link to our research space, which was created by Zoe and her team on the Fulbrighter Network, like community forum area. And this is a place where we'll be able to continue the conversation that we have today. If you saw the agenda already, we have a ton of discussion questions, and there's no way that we're going to get through all of them. But that could be a really great place for sharing resources and sharing any additional ideas that come up after the workshop. Here's the agenda. The first, sorry, I put the links in the wrong order, but the first link that I put in there is a link to the previous workshops that we've done. So the recorded videos, in case you want to take a look and see what we've talked about previously. This workshop today is a little bit different from the previous ones because we did kind of a panelist style workshop before, where we had 3 or 4 people who weren't presented so much as experts, just as people that were guiding the conversation. Today, I'm completely opening it up to everybody. So we want to see more of your ideas, more of your input into the discussion. This is about interviewing, so it's about talking, right? But before we get started, I had been talking with Judith Green, who has been doing some really interesting work. She wanted to take just a couple of minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, to talk about her work and a journal resource that she's been working on. So I'll hand it over to Judith.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm learning a whole lot from listening to different people. My first Fulbright was in 1989 in Brazil, in the time when Brazil was changing from the military to free elections and education. 500 out of every 1,000 children, 500 failed first grade. And my background is in language literacy and teaching, as well as ethnographic research from an ethnography of communication point of view with John Gumpers and Del Himes and other people. And in education, this has been an important issue, but I thought you might like to see what Brazil looked like when I first went. And these were just from the community site. This was what the classroom looked like. So the classroom looked like what I taught in 1960s, which was an open classroom with multiple tasks. This was in a Jesuit school. So you can see different pieces, but this is where we are today. Over the last 3 decades, we've been building a community of researchers and in literacy, and it is an international community, and that's what I will share. And you can see the piece, there are 2 pieces that I'd like to share. One is from a Brazilian journal where they asked us to interview on the relationship of linguistics, applied linguistics, and ethnography. So the ethnography field is influencing the applied linguistics field in many ways, and you'll see that in a minute. But that's Maria Lúcia Castanheira from the Federal University of Brazil with me, and the picture of her mentor, who was the one who introduced me in 1989 to the work they were doing in literacies and how literacies were. She was bringing all the literacy materials together in what's called CEALI, which is the Center for Alphabetization and Escrita, which is, there was no word for literacy in 1989. And so CEALI became the center of this. Magda is now retired, but she builds libraries with children in her local community and still is very active with this, and she's worked for UNESCO and other places. So what Fulbright did for me was it opened a door, not to where I was working, but to other places in Brazil that invited me to speak. And those are the spaces that allowed for this growing community. What we've done now, Maria Lucia Castaneda and I, and Paula Jundi, who's from Sao Paulo, did a special issue of a journal, which is what Kate has asked me to share. The special issue is free, so is the other one I shared with you. And I can leave this on the website, on the chat room, so you can download it. But the issues are free, and we have a group through the Applied Linguistics Association called Literacies Across Languages and Social Domains. And it's an international community. You're welcome to join, or we have a Facebook group, which means you don't have to join the Applied Linguistics Association. You can join our Facebook group, and we are sharing work across national borders, but it's not traditional literacy. It's everyday literacies, plural. And so this is the Facebook group site, and this is the journal site. And I'll show you quickly why this came up. And I want to add something to our interviewing thing, so this will be part of what goes on. In the Journal of Qualitative Research, Social Research, Forum for Qualitative Social Research, which is also a free online resource. It's an open source sponsored by the German government. And you can find Michael Agar's work, which raised questions about how we look at ethnography by any other name, because there are multiple ethnographies. As I'm learning from this community, there are multiple, even more than I thought, ethnographic work that's going on. But he was talking about surprising facts and what is observed. The teaching piece was only a piece of the learning in Fulbright. The learning in Fulbright happened when I did this. In Brazil, that is not okay. That's an obscene gesture. But it took me, the woman was surprised in the store I was in. So accidental happenings helped me as a teacher understand the cultural differences and how my gestures, which are very New York Jewish, were not the ones for communicating in a way. So it's not just the language, but it's languaging with all the social, cultural, and paralinguistic, prosodic, contextual base. And that's why we do the kind of work we're doing, because the surprising fact can lead us to it. And I had an anthropologist explain that to me, not the people who were sponsoring me, because they didn't understand what I was asking. But the same thing happened walking down a street. I didn't know which side to walk on. So these are informal learnings that affect big time. So the other piece was when I went into the classroom, I brought my video camera. I put it where I normally do, which was supposedly unobtrusive. But then the teacher sent some of the children out into the hallway to work on something, and I couldn't move my camera, nor, given the university requirements, could I actually use the camera myself. I had to have somebody else use it. So what was recorded was not my vision. And so these raised all kinds of the questions, and that's what we've done. I'll come back to that later. The special issue has all kinds of things in it that are from international sites or revisiting archives. So reporting one study is not sufficient from our frame, but there are multiple studies possible once you leave the field. And the first one is no rug time sharing, revisioning children's opportunities to enact literate identities through the lens of positioning theory. So what theories guide our explanation? But you can take a look at that at a later time. We have the power of silence. We have learning from the subalterns.
Edith, I'm gonna cut you off there. Sorry, I just want to make sure that we have enough time for the conversation. But this is a great entry into the discussion, and I think especially what you said about learning about all the different types of ethnographies. that are out there is really interesting, and I think what we want to talk about today. If you could unshare your screen, actually, and I'll share mine so that I can get the agenda up on the screen. I think that the very first thing that I wanted to start with today was just this very question of what is interviewing. You know, talking about different ethnographies, different disciplines, different countries, different cultural backgrounds. So for those of you in the room, I'd love to hear from you how you define ethnographic interviewing in your fields and how it differs from, you know, just a regular conversation or other types of interviewing that you might be aware of. And if you would say your relationship to Fulbright also when you begin talking, just so we know all the different, you know, countries that people are coming from or have been to, be great to hear that. I can start with me to get the conversation started. So I did my Fulbright in Brazil in 2018. I'm a dance anthropologist. My background is in dance and performance studies. And so for me, I had some similar experiences to Judith, actually, with learning kind of the cultural gestures and different, let's say, connotations for words that that I thought I understood, but came to understand that there's much more complexity in terms of the cultural context of certain words. For me, interviewing has taken on kind of uh, a different approach throughout the projects that I've done. So for me, sometimes it really is much more about informal conversations and taking a lot of time to get to know people in the community before I actually sit down for what I would consider a formal interview that I record and that I would then transcribe. But then, you know, those formal interviews would be something where, you know, I set aside an hour and a half, sometimes 4 hours, depending on how talkative somebody is, and taking that time to really transcribe it and really analyze the interview after the fact, which is something that we can talk about later, transcribing and coding and analyzing that work. Is there anyone else that would like to share their approaches to interviewing in their field?
I would. This is Anita Charles from Maine, and I was in India in 2016. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so anyway, I'm really interested in this workshop today because I did go back with a small grant from my institution after the full to kind of maneuver in terms of social protocols and things like that. But one thing that I discovered is that I had IRB approval. I had all my consent forms. I was doing everything on the up and up. We had contacted a number of people and it explained the whole project. I had full explanations. We had it in Hindi as well. So everything was translated. And what I discovered is that when I get somewhere, people would not sign consent forms. And we would get going. We'd get talking sort of informally, like you said. And it would, you know, I would very quickly veer it towards my questions. So maybe we'd start off, oh yeah, how are things going? Well, tell me about your program. And then I'd guide in, sort of easing into the interview questions. And what I discovered was that initially I would stop and say, I can't do this interview without you signing this consent form. And what I realized is that they simply would not sign it until after the interview was done, and they felt that they could trust me, and they knew that I was really there for asking the kinds of questions that was supporting their work. And I had to kind of learn to live with that. And you know, I didn't think it was, I think it was culturally appropriate to do that, I guess is what I would say. But it meant bending what I thought in my head was the absolute right way to do something. And I just, I got all the forms signed anytime I used anything, but I had to wait at least even till partway through for people to really believe that they could trust me and that they were signing on something they could talk to me about. So I just wanted to share that because it was challenging, and I'm mostly interested in how do you engage, our informal conversations, things that you can, and we recorded them. Are these things that you can then use later in some way without going through all of the consent steps? That's a big question on my mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I heard you say that they trusted you enough to do the interview without signing consent first, but then also that they had to trust you, before they would sign it. So there's like, they trusted you in one sense, but not in the other quite yet, which is really interesting. And
Exactly. I found it interesting too, because I would notify these places and my colleague said they won't see you. They will not have you come in and do this. And in every case they said, yes, please come on in. We're very happy to talk with you. And then that last step, they just didn't trust enough. Yeah, I found it very paradoxical, but I made it work. And I did have a colleague that was Indian with me at all times, which helped a lot. But yeah, there was a real trust factor about who am I coming in and doing this work, and if I sign off on something, what does that suddenly mean I'm doing? And yeah, it was trust building, but it was interesting that they certainly opened up their experiences and allowed me to be there.
yeah, and also this question about informal conversations and how you use them. I don't usually record informal conversations, but I certainly use them because they shape my entire experience. And I'm writing about dance, so often that'll be like just a something that's shared in the middle of a class, like shouted across the room, and that's like the key, quote that I need. But as to whether I attribute it to somebody and I name that person, or if I just say, people say this in the community. Is there anyone else that wants to speak about, let's move on to this issue of trust and creating rapport, because I think this is probably one of the bigger issues that we encounter in ethnographic interviewing.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hi, Nancy.
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Well, I'm a Fulbrighter, but in this case, I'm a Colombian going into the United States. So I was in the United States conducting my PhD studies in 2013, between 2013 and 2017, and now I'm back home working at a public university. So I'm a Fulbrighter, going now to your country over there. So yeah, my experience with ethnographic research, well, I will touch three key points, and one of them has to do with the positionality. When we think about interviewing, I'm grounding on the fields of Chicana, Latina feminisms and indigenous knowledges. So from these perspectives, when it comes for me to interact with different communities, I start hello, ya voy, mi amor, ya voy. I'm sorry, I'm with my little nephew in here, so it's kind of what goes on when you work at home. So anyways, going back to the point, so I'm grounded on Chicana Latina feminisms, and for us, being a self in relation is very important. So building relationships with community. So I also experienced the ethical dilemmas that our friend was sharing before, in terms of who am I to be here in this community, like asking for people to tell me their stories. So as part of my understanding of critical ethnography that I conducted in the US with houseless people, I started to learn how to let go, right? So let go my expectations as a researcher when I come into the field, allowing people for us to build relationships first, and from there on, get into the interviewing or dialogue space whenever they felt comfortable, in the spaces that they felt comfortable, and trying for me as a researcher also to move away from that colonial lens of me wanting to get certain information for my own research purposes. So it was a negotiation process that goes in between. And then what I learned was that, for me, this mutual recognition, like being in communion with others is very key when we engage into any kind of research from a decolonial perspective. So I will share just that portion of reflection by now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think this idea of letting go is really key for me too. I know that I went into the field really with like no ethnographic training at all, thinking, you know, that I had to have all these plans and that I needed to have all my questions ready ahead of time, and that it would have to be very like, you know, IRB kind of makes you, or whatever like ethics review board you're using kind of requires you to have that kind of preparation. But when you get there, you know, in the field, it's like, it's got to be, I feel that it has to be communicated, right? And going with the flow and letting go of that control a little bit.
Is it okay, would I be able to ask a question of both you, Kate, and Nancy have mentioned some things that I feel like are similar, and I'm a PhD student, and I am writing up my dissertation proposal now using Black feminism to inform my ethnography, and so much of what you were saying, Nancy, with regards to doing things in relation and building relationships with in the communities that you're working with really resonated with me. I think the question that comes up for me is that is a time of relationship building. You're also kind of forming perceptions, and you know, in a way it's shaping a little bit of what you said, Kate, of like that informal thing that gets said in the dance studio or a dance class of that someone shouts out is gonna like shape things that you might think about your research. And so I'm kind of curious about like how you navigate that with IRB requirements. Do those people, have they signed consent forms? Is it okay? And so just as a PhD student who doesn't really have a lot of folks around me who are doing ethnography, I think I'm trying to understand the technicalities of things.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I know that I was advised with my IRB to just put down kind of a list of questions and scenarios that I thought I might find myself in. And when I got to the field, it was like, it was totally different, right? I had learned so much, even after a couple of weeks, that you know, I looked back at those questions and I was like, oh, I was so naive. I knew nothing, you know. But I do think, at least in my field, right, dance anthropology, there is so much flexibility in terms of how embodied knowledge is kind of shared. And I think this could even apply to other disciplines, right? Because we all use gestures to communicate in certain ways, and there isn't really like an ethics board kind of recognition of that kind of work. So I feel like there is some flexibility to talk about, you know, what a body is saying versus what is a quote that comes out of somebody's mouth. But that, you know, that's an issue to think about.
Can I share something? This is Judith.
Of course.
Let me put the video. Oh, okay. The key from a sociolinguistic point of view is that when we go to doing analysis of video or other things, the sociolinguistic base doesn't identify everybody. We begin by having a theory of how people communicate and what the issue is, and we're looking at that, and IRBs don't seem to have as much trouble with that level of analysis when you start. But if you start with the theory that's guiding you for the explanation, then that becomes a different question. So we have what we call an orienting theory, which is how do we look at human interaction and communication and transcribing and representing, not representing, because through these theories we're representing the people, so we're not claiming truth in that sense, but through this lens you can begin to understand this communication in a different way than so that there is a history within the sociolinguistic or ethnography of communication world that may be useful for people who are interested in other forms of ethnography that IRBs don't have as much trouble with, because it talks about the frameworks you're bringing to the interactional process. I'll stop there.
Is there anyone else who has dealt with another ethics review board besides IRB?
I would like to to ask something as well.
Yeah.
I am a first year, no, now second year PhD student. So for me, this is my first experience doing fieldwork. So I am researching from United States to my country, it's Chile. So in this moment in my country, there are a very huge problem with human rights, with protesters. And I am working with them, with some of them. And during the design process, I had so many problems in my mind, because it's like the IRB wanted that I protect them, but at the same time, I never knew the limits, because it's like I want to protect them, but at the same time, I have to do this through internet, first of all. And second, like my positionality is very complicated because I am activist as well. So the way that I approach to them is, I don't know. In this moment, I am doing interviews, but I don't understand how is the limit, because I am activist, because I am, and at the same time, I am watching through TV that they are living something that I never lived there. So very complicated human issues of human rights. So I think that I have been struggling with me in an ethical way all the time. I want to do something that creates some kind of impact in them, but at the same time, I don't know how to connect with them without give them like so much expectation about what will happen with my research. And at the same time, I don't know the limits, because even I think that I am struggling with a lot of ethical issues. So I know that most of you have more experience than me, and I would like to know if you can tell me something about it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. This question actually came up a couple of times in the discussion questions that you all in the registration form had suggested, was this idea of what if an interviewee is concerned about punishment by some kind of authority, or if there is some kind of legal concern, right, with sharing what's private information or something that's currently being looked at in court, for example. And the issue of being an activist yourself, right, is also, and none of us is an objective researcher, right? And an activist is specifically trying to make some kind of intervention or enact some kind of change, right? So that dispels the myth that we're just like watching through, objective eyes or listening through objective ears, right?
Yeah, that's why I think that when we work with communities, the best thing that we can do is being honest with them and being in constant dialogue. Like when we work with communities, what has happened to me is that they want to have a voice, and they want to be heard, and they want their stories to be told, and they want to be themselves the ones who tell their stories. So that's why I transitioned from semi-structured interviews in my field. I transitioned into testimonials. I ended up like collecting all these testimonials, and Chicana Latina feminism speaks about what's the use of testimonials, and Latin America is the original place where testimonials were precisely raised as a form of denouncing, by communities. That's the origin of testimonials, right? So communities have been using it as a tool of resistance, as a tool to tell the other truth that the oppressive systems do not tell, right? So my advice to you, because I know that this is a very complicated issue, is be in constant dialogue with the people you're working with, right? And as a researcher, let it go. I mean, like, don't exert too much pressure on what you want or what you expect or how your research question is being framed. You can navigate and adjust all the time. We can adjust, right? But then communities, so you be upfront with them and ask them, okay, so is there a risk for your life, for the procedure or the legal process that you have in court if you share these pieces of your story? So let us not tell those pieces of your story. Or if the person wants, okay, do you want this part of your story to be told, and how do you want it to be told? And then of course we have this option of the pseudonyms that we can use. So then, and if you want to present also the story, how do you want the story to be presented, right? Because there's different strategies that we can use. We can bring multiple voices. That's one of my exercises with my students. So we wanted to tell the testimonials of a population that was at risk. So we joined different testimonials into only one story. So we had in one story 13 voices talking. And so this is a testimonial, a collective testimonial being put together, and no one could be easily identified, let's say. So there's a strategies. So, I mean, so we are talking here about different things. One of the things is your positionality and your relationship with the community. The other thing deals with the procedures, so how you are contacting them and if those procedures are putting the population at risk. And the other thing is in terms of the data that is being collected, or the stories or the testimonials that you are collecting, in the ways of how you're doing it. That was the previous point, but then how you are going to present them by the end of your story. And being mindful of all those, yeah, you don't want to put population at risk if it is not feasible for them at this point in time. So then you can change the focus of how you want to present information, or what is the focus of your study or the research question you want to explore. So those are things to continue thinking about. But I know it's important for us in Latin America. Like I'm kind of an activist. Well, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but anyways, some people see me like that. For us, it's important to have our stories being told and our testimonials to be out there, so that people know the stories, the truth about what's going on from the grassroots movements. So yeah.
Maybe Nancy, for me, it makes so much sense what you are telling me. So maybe, I don't know if you have some paper that you can recommend me.
If you want, I don't know, I can give you my contact info and we can be in touch, my email and my cell phone number in Colombia, and we can be in touch. I was gonna write it down in the chat and we can continue talking if you want. Yeah, perfect, Paula, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I should say, if anyone has any resources to share with the group, please feel free to use the chat. I'll just share the transcript after the workshop with the video. Heather had her hand up a while ago, so I want to give her an opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Can you hear me first?
Yeah.
Making sure. Okay. So, so I'm Heather Barfield, and I just returned from my Fulbright research in France. I'm a U.S. Fulbright scholar. I live in Texas, in Austin, and I was doing work with migrant organizations in the south of France. One organization that actually is more focused on helping exploited women from trafficking and helping them with their, the bureaucratic processes of French citizenship. And well, I think many of us know what that's all about, the performance of bureaucracy, if you will. And then the other organization was in Aix-en-Provence, an organization called Agir that also helps migrants in that region. And I'm a theater practitioner, and I'm also, my undergraduate is in anthropology. And so as a social anthropologist and as a performance studies like Kate, but also I'm a theater director and a theater writer, but I make devised theater work. And what that means is that I use the stories, as we were talking about earlier, or maybe not use, but I incorporate stories of the people involved in the room to create live performance projects and products, if you will. Like Nancy was saying, in some ways what I was doing was creating testimonial spaces in body and in movement and in gesture and in voice and in expression. And because many of the people involved in my workshops, French is not their first language, like me, right? So I'm also coming to France with being, a second or third language. I know some Spanish and French, but my first language is obviously English. But I'm working with people from all over, and all of which, you know, we're all trying to speak in the one language that that is decided upon. And so there's a time and a place in which I throw out the interview questions, right? I'm like, I can't even communicate this, and neither can you really answer this in a way that you feel authentic. So maybe there are other ways that we can create authenticity in response to these questions through exercises. I also use, we talked about Brazil, right? So I use Augusto Boal's the Theater of the Oppressed work often. I was also doing some stuff from tectonic theater and moment work, and I've worked with Jean-Claude Van Natali, who's an American playwright from the 60s who does this thing called writing on your feet, and where a lot of the storytelling is based in, and Guillermo Gomez Peña's work in radical activist theater as well. We were doing those exercises. The idea being that I really didn't want to dictate responses. I felt very often that I was more like the I was the person kind of like churning the machine wheel, right? I was in the background being like, okay, let me just kind of put this in the machine and see what happens. And we would literally do make a machine as a group. And the note that I took earlier was in response to something Nancy was saying about testimonials and like bodies in space. Like sometimes it's not an individual story that I was interested in. It was what happens when I put this Algerian migrant next to the Russian migrant, next to the Turkish migrant, next to the local French volunteer, next to a Chad migrant, right? So all 5 of these people, however many I named, are all on stage together in their own bodies and their own gestural languages and their own ways of interpreting. And the thing about theater is that, you know, and lots of research has been done on this, is that expressions tend to be almost universal. Fear in the face is almost universal, right? Anger is almost universal. Like these expressions can be they can be communicated without the use of language. And so I found it to be, and I'm still, because this is so fresh to me, I'm still really working on putting a lot of this information down, and the, you know, the name of my project was called Performing Migrant Stories, but it's such like a broad title because in many ways we're always performing all the time. You know, there's always already an aspect of oneself within the space that we're in that's always being performed. And what I was trying to do with this group is to give them an honest and safe enough space, which took a little bit of time, right? Clearly, right? And we do that through play. We played together in the theater space. We workshopped stuff. It was very low risk for the participants. So then they eventually made higher and higher riskier choices for them. None of these people are actors, right? So these are non-actors sharing their stories, sometimes linguistically, well, not without language. And the results became extremely demonstrative, right? And of course, this is way more complicated than what I'm describing here, but I just kind of wanted to give some recognition to that there are other, the ways that I was doing my ethnographic research was mostly based in embodied, almost self-reflexive research methods, and also a sense of appreciating how we can communicate our wants, needs, and desires simply through kind of visceral embodiment in front of one another. That's all I have to say. Right. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, I love that. Somebody had written in the registration form as a discussion topic, the output of our research, which, as we've talked about in previous workshops, is not just publications, right? And this person had also mentioned creative nonfiction. And so I'm also thinking about, I don't know if that person is here right now, but this also relates to, the devised theater work that Heather is doing. And it's really interesting for me because so much of the input for my research is this embodied, gestural, embodied knowledge kind of thing. But my output tends to be, written, which is such a challenge because there's so much nonverbal that needs to be described in certain ways. So I love this idea that the output of the research, right, is gestures and facial expressions and that kind of thing. There's so much that can be read there.
And group camaraderie, strangers learning about strangers so that they're no longer strangers to one another.
Yeah, talk about building community, right? And creating rapport, not just between you and the interviewees or whatever you want to call them, but amongst themselves as well.
If I can, one of the challenges that colleagues of mine are facing in Hong Kong when we're doing problem-based medicine is how to represent or use visuals from the video. And what Susan Bridges has created is to do a drawing over it so it blurs the face, but it gives you the focus on the gestures, the movement, the multiple text, because we deal with multimodalities in text and how different texts are being used in different ways in a problem-based learning context for medical doctors. So the key question becomes, instead of using the full visual as I did, could I draw over those to get the point I'm trying to get out in a way that then shows the idea that's being promoted in contrast to the full face of the person or body of the person. It's just something that Susan built from the medical field, which allows us to then show that coordination of different groups and different activities in a way that is not able to go back to the individual. So just an idea.
Thank you. Anita, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. I think, I might have been the one that asked about creative nonfiction, and it definitely connects to what some of the other people have shared here in terms of what the output is and what are we sharing, what are we gathering, how are we portraying that later down the road. And I'm struggling with that because I have a really strong interest in doing something more along the lines of a creative nonfiction kind of book or product that is really about that storytelling, which is really about the people sharing their lives and their stories together in a way that isn't necessarily sitting down and doing a formalized interview that's I don't have any issue doing that. I'm happy to get IRB consent to do interviews, but what I really want to do is capture sort of a lived time and also through my eyes as somebody who's coming in as that person. And I'm really struggling with how, if I'm enjoying an experience, let's say, so one of the experiences I had was being on somebody's rooftop eating dinner. Well, I know I can describe that in a book, but what if they're talking with me about what they're doing and how they're doing it? And then I write that up later. Obviously I can use pseudonyms. I can do some of that creative kind of combining stories into something, but is that, where am I crossing a line? Do I have some ethical, are there any resources that anybody knows about that helps to distinguish between creative nonfiction and ethnography, for example? That would be really helpful to me.
That's a great question. I don't have any resources, but if anybody has any, please put them in the chat or send them to me afterwards and I'll send them around. This conversation is making me think about kind of the artificial way that we've separated these workshops, right? The previous workshop was about participant observation and this one is about interviewing, but there's clearly, a path between both of them and that they're both informing one another. And it's so hard to kind of draw the line between, you know, what you learn in an interview and what you just experience at a dinner party or in a dance class or in a theater space, or collecting these testimonials, right? That kind of thing, working in the communities. And I know that for me, like earlier I said, often I spend a lot of time with the community before I do an interview, so that the interview is kind of like an opportunity to verify my perspectives, like what I thought I learned, and ask, is this, did I read this correctly, or you know, is there another way that we could be looking at this?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep speaking, but I think it also touches on, and people have talked about dance, but also things like photography, the pictures that you take. And I'm very, very conscious about what picture am I taking, why am I taking it, how am I taking it, what is going to be seen in it when if I share this picture. And, you know, I do some blogging, and so I might share, you know, and somebody in a public space, and I've even looked up like what are the rules around getting consent for sharing a photo. You know, if I'm out in a market and I take a photo, I know I don't have to get consent from everybody in that market, but you know, what am I conveying about a population by taking pictures? And so
What course? Okay.
that we bring literally the lens, the photographic lens. So
There is a book that Deborah Tannen did on looking at a Thanksgiving dinner with New Yorkers and Californians and others. And she did something interesting in the way she did it. She did the technical as an appendix for the experts, and she wrote the other as a more popular one so that she could go into the dinner conversation. But that then led to how she the decisions she made were for the technical end, but it was an appendix. It's a double text model. Michael Agar used some of that in his work too, the double text, the text for the researchers, for the technical people, and the text for everyday people coming forward. And Deborah's work influenced his, and his work influenced hers. And that Deborah is a sociolinguist, but does more Gumper's ethnography of communication, and Agar is a linguistic anthropologist. So these pieces allow you to do both, but not in the same place in the text, or cross-referencing the text to a technical, because we're moving between audiences. And that is something I wanted to raise, is who are the audiences for these kinds of outcomes of this kind of work? It seems we have multiple audiences depending on who we're writing for, as well as how we're writing. So I'm just raising that question, but those volumes might be of interest. It's Conversational Style Analyzing Talk Among Friends was Deborah's book back in the 1980s, early 90s. So it may be a useful kind of thing to look at how she brought up the complex intercultural communication, but then the technical aspect of doing it.
Yeah, Anita and Judith, this is also reminding me of what we're dealing with right now. Like, obviously we've been in an increasingly digital world, but right now completely digital for all intents and purposes. And you know, something that I've struggled a lot with is if a photo is posted on social media, or even a conversation, a thread of comments on social media, is that kind of ethnographic information? How can I use it? It's not an interview, but I have used quotes from public groups or public pages that, presumably the person knows that anybody in the world could see it. My advisor told me that that was fair game, so I used it, but it brings up a really interesting ethical question. Photographs too, right, have become kind of like, oh, well, everybody's fine with putting their image online. But of course, that's not true. And there are lots of things that we need to do to protect people's identities. And, Pamela, I'm interested too. You said that you're doing interviews right now. I'm assuming that that's all digital, happening virtually right now. So I'm interested in, how interviews are going now, how this research is going now, given the current situation.
You're raising an interesting question for me. We think about the question, what is a video a record of? And who made the video from what angle? So when we're interpreting it, how do we know, how are we able to take that ethnographic frame of stepping back from the known and tracing the roots of the video? And so that's a question that there is a special issue of a Lithuanian journal. There's a group in the UK on rethinking ethnography, and they did a special issue across things. And one of the pieces that was done was on what's an archive and archive up and what's a video record of. So I'm just raising that, but there are resources there of people across national borders in education doing, rethinking some of the issues you're raising.
I was typing into the text box, but it's hard for me to listen and type. But I just want to say that I'm actually continuing my workshops via Zoom because they wanted me to continue these workshops with them, which is very flattering. And also, like, that's all, it's very strange, complicated, all kinds of things that I'm still trying to figure out. But I think that the point isn't about me necessarily. It's about the oh, it's such a terrible word. There is a little magic that happens in the ritualization of being in community together and creating little bits of art theatrically, and it feeds them. And I feel like I am helping to contribute to the growth of this blooming community, a very tiny corner of the world with people that have survived enormous adversity and are wanting a place to play. I mean, there's no other way I can describe that. I don't focus when I'm working with them, I don't want them to tell me their trauma stories. I'm not interested in that kind of, I think, sort of pornographic way of having people talk about their the injustices that they've survived. I'm really into helping them find that place of happiness within themselves by just offering up some of these simple exercises that can have profound effect. And so much so that now I'm moving my research even more into thinking more and more about drama therapy techniques, which that's not my specialty. But I only get to this place by listening to what they want to share first, as opposed to me telling them what I need to know to conduct my research. What do they think is important for me to know? And I get that by trying to be a really open-ended in the beginning. And so, yeah, so in online tech, I'm still doing this work. I'm still, it's actually amazing that this COVID has happened, because now we can do this work. And now I'm having to learn as an artist how to do this work, which is mostly live work via Zoom. I mean, I'm in a conference all week this week with professionals in my field. So it's constantly evolving what this is,
For me at the beginning, it was so difficult to work through internet about these issues, because in the second semester of my first year, I was working in my design and I have to change everything on a way. So it was so difficult, but in this moment I decide to take this as an opportunity and not as a problem. So I realized that I will live the same issue that they are living. For example, they have to do political actions through internet. So this makes me understand the issues that they are living, doing what they want to do. So for example, I am trying to be so conscious about these issues to understand their dynamics, And on the other side, I think that they feel more comfortable because they are from their houses. They can disconnect their cameras and things like that. So I think that is the question is how I can use this as an opportunity and not as a problem. I will lose many issues in any case. If I go there, maybe I will have problems to join with them, or maybe in the middle of this they will be arrested by the police and I cannot. This is there. I think that could happen so many things. So everything is about to think how this could be an opportunity for me.
Absolutely. I mean, I keep on thinking about how this is a moment in history, right? So whatever we find right now and whatever ways we find to get around the limitations that we have right now to connect with other people is just going to be, you know, fascinating 100 years from now or something, you know, like this is going to change the way that we connect with people in the future. I don't think it's going to be done in, you know, a year or something. It's definitely, we're going to have a lot more opportunities to connect virtually. Like, this is wonderful to be with all of you, you know, and have these conversations. And I also have been experiencing this feeling of being able to hide behind the screen and maybe being a little bit more open to sharing or trying new things, or I find myself more talkative, for example, on Zoom, because like I can see everybody at the same time. You can read the facial expressions better, like the timing for when to come into a conversation. It's been fascinating. So I also see this as an opportunity to, you know, learn new ways that people connect, right?
At the same time, I think that is an opportunity in terms of we can register, we can record things that is happening now and then will never happen, but could happen again. But we are living a very historical moment. So I usually ask things about the pandemic, how changed the pandemic, some things. So I think that I appreciate the opportunity to can register this that is changing, this issue which is changing the world for the rest of the the history, I think. So this is an opportunity as well, I think.
I'm just catching up with the chat right now, and I saw a question from a prospective Fulbrighter. And I just wanted to mention, if anybody has resources for anybody starting out with ethnography that you might want to share in the chat, that would be great. I think that Judith has already given us a lot of resources that we could be jotting down. And also, if you just want to write in the chat, like where you are in your Fulbright research, have you already gone? Was it like 30 years ago? Was it last year? What your field is, just so that, you know, people get a sense of who's in here. I think we have people who are PhD students who are who maybe were English teaching assistants in the past, researchers coming to the US, all that sort of thing. So should have asked you all to do that at the beginning, but I just saw that in the chat.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So, hi, I'm Parul, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in India. And I am actually a grantee for the current cohort, that is, you know, like the 2020, 2021 cohort. And as you all know that, you know, like it's all been sort of, you know, like stopped worldwide, the entire Fulbright program. So my research actually is around oral history, and it revolves around the oral history of partition of India, the creation of Pakistan. So I essentially was involved in, you know, interviewing people who were born before 1947. That is the year when India was partitioned. So for that purpose, you know, what I did, because in India, as far as my knowledge goes, and in the universities that I have attended so far, the field of oral history is not very developed. So we are not taught exactly like, how to do, what to do, and, like, I mean, what to do, what not to do kind of things in context of, interviewing people, different kind of interviews and all of that. So for that purpose, what I did was that I sort of got connected with the archive, which is called the 1947 Partition Archive. It's based in Berkeley. So they sort of helped me, they are into crowdsourcing, and through crowdsourcing, they are, collecting a lot of oral histories around partition all around the world. So with their help, I was able to gain a lot of insight in terms of, the kind of questionnaire, that you should develop. And because this is such a traumatic and a very sensitive topic, how should I go about, the interview and everything. So like that is something, that really helped me in my interview process. And, especially because in the field of history, oral history is still a very contested field. We still resort to archival sources as, more authentic sources. So that is something that I was again struggling with while conducting interviews of people who were actually migrants, who migrated from what is today Pakistan into the new territory of India back in 47, 48, those times.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we might segue into, we've been jumping all around on the agenda, but this question of kind of the nitty gritty of transcription and coding, I'm interested in people's approaches to what you do with an interview, or now I'm adding to my list testimonial or oral history stories, or Heather, theater work, right? How you work with these data. Yeah, Judith.
This is a topic that we've spent a lot of time on, and actually within the TESOL community, the Teaching of English as a Second Language and Pragmatics group, it's called the politics of transcribing. Because what we are doing is we are representing we're creating the other. We're not representing the other. Even when you use their voice, you've made choices and selections. So how we transcribe is graphically relevant. If you do it in question, answer, you're retaining, according to this work, a power relationship. So we put the interviewer and the interviewee in two different columns. And since English is a left to right language, but I grew up with a right to left language also, we shift the position. So we position the interviewer in the right-hand column and the interviewee in the left-hand column, which is the dominant column for English. And that way you can trace the flow of the dialogue as it's developing, especially if you're not doing a predefined set of questions, but you're having a conversation, a process, or what Bradley calls an ethnographic conversation. So if you do that, you can then reconstruct. And what Audra Skukauskaitė, who's from one of our colleagues and is from Lithuania originally, she actually did this with Lithuanian teachers born working prior to the Soviet takeover, during the Soviet, post what they call Free Lithuania, okay? And her interview traced and did what she called storying. So she took one message and looked at if it repeated over time, then she could graphically show the elements of building the story through that kind of analysis. But how you graphically transcribe is a theoretical perspective that influences what you can understand, know, come to understand, see, or do. And it also shows the role of you said, I think, Kate, that you have 4-hour interviews.
Yeah, sometimes I have talkative people.
Well, Audra had the same thing. She had a question, and then the teacher that she knew and was talking with her took over and did 3 hours of interviews, and she could only ask 3 questions, basically. So this whole question, Sage Press has a series of resources on transcribing and interviewing from the education point of view that may be useful for people, but they're research books, little ones, tiny ones, not big, thick ones you don't ever get through. And so that may be a resource, and she has put one together on transcribing that may be useful. But I think that's one of the pieces we don't think about. We think about transcribing as just writing the words down. But you're talking about the dance, you're talking about the movement. We just keep adding columns. So how you transcribe so you can go back and forth between words and actions and words and paralinguistics or whatever becomes an important piece for us, at least from a more interactional sociolinguistic base. So I don't know if that helps.
That's totally fascinating. I had never thought about the left to right, right to left reading, and then the dominant versus not dominant columns. Yeah, I just love that. I think that's fascinating. And you just made me think about one of the issues that I have when I did my Fulbright in Brazil. I paid a transcriber to transcribe because it was, if I had a 3 or 4 hour interview, like there was no way that I had the ear to be able to do that in any kind of efficient way. So I paid somebody, but thinking about, what are the liberties that transcriber took to put their own interpretation into what they had heard. Similarly, I've done field work in Montserrat, which is a Caribbean island, English-speaking Caribbean island, but they have very strong accents. And I would find myself having to listen to things a million times, and then eventually, I didn't understand that. I'm just gonna try to pretend that I understood the context and put something together that makes sense, and ... I didn't get that part, that kind of thing. And so the transcription does become kind of this living document that is certainly in no ways objective. And somebody put that into the registration form too, the myth of the objective transcript.
Right, that just to add to what you're saying is John Gumbers has a PBS, not PBS, a BBC film called called Multiracial Britain. It was done back in the 80s, I think. And it talks about how even the stress patterns lead to interpretations of people. So as you're thinking about it, and I've designed a system, if you're interested, for how you can look at the text as it's being built bit by bit. It's very labor intensive, but even in transcribing, we don't transcribe in sentences. We transcribe in units where we call message units that go to actions, that go to turns, that go to interactions, that then become phases of activity. And so you can build the text up just as you read a text that unfolds. So the key question of how you do it, there are systems. Most people use conversation analysis. We don't. We overlap with it, but we're looking more at the meanings that are being proposed as it's being built, and the turn taking and as a phenomenon that's coming in. But the people inscribe worlds in bits and pieces, not in full sentences. So even the grammar structures get disrupted.
Yeah. Talia is asking in the chat if anyone has any tips on translating and transcribing. And I take that as a general question in your various fields.
There's a system called Transana that allows you to document and build the whole system for yourself and record all your decision making. And they now have a transcription system with it too. Zoom does transcription, but the other piece Transana might be something useful. Instead of you having predefined everything, it allows you to look at build an index, an archive, a system for yourself as you're going through, and then you can reconstruct it at the end. Just might be a resource.
Great. Thank you. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the Zoom room right now who does work in quote unquote the hard sciences or the medical field and using ethnographic methods, specifically interviewing, for that work. I see Talia's box lit up, but I don't know if that means she wants to speak.
This is Judith again. Sorry, I feel like, but I've been doing this for 5 decades. So people tell me I'm a walking encyclopedia sometimes. Susan Bridges at the University of Hong Kong and Mona Lisa Chan, who is a postdoc with her, do that kind of work. And Susan and I have written for the Learning Sciences on how to do what we call interactional ethnography. And it's being picked up through the medical field and others, tracing students' clinical reasoning as it develops. That's Mona's interest. Susan does problem-based learning, how you design them, how it gets implemented and taken up. There is a whole field of study within an ethnographic base from an interactional base that does that kind of work. A lot of the medical field want to know that things are generalizable. This is taking in the situated, and it frames the notion that we're trying to theorize these processes, not just practices, identify practices, and build new theoretical, which is the concept of telling case studies rather than whole system studies. So that might be something of interest. There's a series of publications she's done with medical and dental and health science people. But, and then Tim Koshman has done work with Carl Fredrickson that looks at the training of doctors through the simulation processes and through the discourse and the interactions. So both of those might be resources for people interested in the medical and health field. And we have a project in Lithuania where they're redoing the whole of health science education because of the shift. Lithuania's only been out of Soviet rule since 1990. And they're bringing in the ethnographic and discourse work and qualitative research to begin to understand people doing walk-alongs so that they go on a walk with a special person who's going to need a doctor's help, or these are mostly special ed, and or to go into the medical context so that the instructors at the university can then look at the kind of context today in this shifting policy and social world. That you might, Ludmila, oh, I can't pronounce her last name, sorry. But if you're interested, Audra Skukoskaite and Ludmila are doing this and have begun to write about the project. It's a 4-year EU project. So.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any other topic that we haven't covered yet, I want to open the floor to just anything you have on your mind at all.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. My name's Andres Marana. I'm here in the United States, in Virginia. I'll be going to Jordan in the winter, hopefully. It's kind of tangentially related, but how have kind of other Fulbrighters or PhDs kind of captured their experiences? I know people doing workshops and kind of have done some pretty impressive ways to capture everything, like setting up, starting foundations and everything. But if they have recommendations for other ways to sort of capture their experiences or how they've shared those, especially knowing that like some of this might be socially distanced, and then kind of connecting that with your like how you've navigated kind of everything that you've been talking about, IRB, no IRB, iterative like approaches and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great actually segue into like wrapping up this conversation and getting us ready for the next conversation. Our next workshop is going to deal specifically with kind of the outcomes of Fulbright research and what we do when we come back. In many cases, that the sharing of our research findings would be a publication, but as one of our previous panelists, Gordon, he was with us for the past 2 workshops. I don't think he's here today, but he was adamant that we not forget that not everybody who's a Fulbrighter is an academic or has continued to work in academia, and so that there are many, many different ways that this work can be applied. So that might be like, for example, Gordon does festival music production. Heather, for example, would be doing devised theater work, which is not kind of traditional scholarship. I put that in quotes. And various other things like starting foundations or starting nonprofit organizations or other ways that this work feeds into some kind of public service or public good. So I think, I think that these workshops that Fulbridge and Fulbrighter Network are putting on are a really great opportunity for those of us who have had the Fulbright experience to share the different ways that we're using this work. Like I said at the beginning of the workshop, the research forum space, actually I'll put the link in the chat again in case you didn't see it at the beginning, is going to be a place where we can continue to have these conversations. Anything that comes up, if you're like, oh, what was that book again, or the name of that researcher or whatever, then you can ask it there, and hopefully somebody will come in and answer your question.
Great, thank you.
All right, if there are no other comments, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for joining us. It's really great to see all of the names in the boxes here in the space, even if I couldn't see your face, and the chat was on fire, so that's great. And again, I'll share out the chat transcript when I share out the recorded video. I'll keep you all on the list for when we advertise the next workshop. It's going to be towards the end of September, so we've been doing these every 2 months. We're also, Zoe and I have also been planning on doing another series after this, which is yet to be determined, but we'll keep you all posted on what we're planning to do. And do keep in touch with me, like if you have ideas for another workshop, or specifically if it's about ethnographic workshops, you can email me. If you have an idea for a completely different workshop, you can contact Zoe. Go to fulbridge.org for ways to contact. And yeah, let me know if you have any feedback or any ideas. I'll be sending out a survey too when I send out the email with the chat and the video, just so you can hear, or so that I can hear and you can share your thoughts on the workshop as we improve. All right, thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. We're also rotating the times of these so that we can try to get people in various parts of the world at different times. So that's a challenge. We can never get everybody awake at the same time, but we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.